Heritage Prime wasn't just big. It was the kind of architectural obscenity that made you wonder if someone had lost a bet with physics and decided to double down anyway. The orbital station stretched across space like a chrome-plated monument to galactic arrogance, all sweeping curves and impossible angles that screamed, "We have the technology, and we're not afraid to use it." Somewhere deep in its bowels, probably powered by the crushed dreams of engineering students across a dozen systems, the Galactic Historical Museum sat like a jewel in a very, very expensive crown. Or maybe more like a tumor in an otherwise healthy body, depending on your perspective. Justin had perspectives. Lots of them, actually, which his colleagues back on Earth found either refreshing or exhausting, depending on how many drinks they'd had. As a xenoarchaeologist, and yes, he'd had to explain that job title about 8,000 times to relatives who thought he just played in alien dirt. He'd spent the better part of a decade piecing together the fragments of dead civilizations. Bones told stories. Artifacts whispered secrets. And sometimes, if you listened carefully enough and had the right scanning equipment, the past reached up and slapped the present right across its smug face. Today felt like one of those days. The museum's entrance hall could have swallowed a small moon, or at least a decent-sized asteroid. Crystal panels lined the walls, each one displaying a different conquered species in their final moments, because nothing says cultural institution quite like extinction porn. Tourist groups from a dozen different worlds milled about, their translator devices creating a low buzz of overlapping conversations that sounded like a malfunctioning computer trying to sneeze. "This way, human," Fexmol clicked, his mandibles producing that particularly grating tone that suggested he'd rather be doing literally anything else. The Khalid curator stood roughly 2 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the museum's carefully calibrated lighting. 6 arms gestured with the kind of practiced boredom that came from giving this tour 10,000 times too many. "Try to keep up. I have actual important visitors scheduled after you." Justin smiled the kind of smile that had gotten him through 3 years of academic committee meetings without committing murder. "I'll do my best not to slow you down with my primitive human brain." The sarcasm sailed right over Fexmol's antennae. "Yes, well, at least you acknowledge your limitations. Refreshing, really." They passed through the Hall of Minor Extinctions first, which sounded like a rejected album title but was actually just rows upon rows of display cases featuring species who'd had the misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time throughout galactic history. A crystalline species who'd refused to leave their homeworld when their sun went nova. Stubborn to the end, Fexmol noted with something approaching approval. An aquatic civilization that had achieved space travel but couldn't figure out how to build ships that didn't leak. Natural selection at its finest. A peaceful herbivore race that had been too trusting when the Khalid Empire came knocking with trade agreements. Fexmol glossed over that one pretty quickly. Justin took notes, his tablet humming quietly as it recorded everything. Each display came with holographic recreations, DNA samples sealed in stasis fields, and commentary that managed to be simultaneously educational and deeply unsettling. Around them, alien tourists snapped photos, their various appendages holding up devices that looked like they'd been designed by committee after a heavy lunch. A group of Khalid younglings pressed their faces against a case containing the preserved remains of a species that had apparently tried to negotiate for peace instead of building weapons. Their teacher droned on about evolutionary dead ends, while the kids giggled at the primitive tools on display. Justin kept his expression neutral. Being the first human granted access to this section of the museum was an honor, supposedly. Earth's admission to the Galactic Council had been recent enough that the paint was still wet on their metaphorical membership card, and most species still treated humans like the new kid at school who might have lice. Getting invited here meant someone, somewhere, had decided humanity was worth including in the cool kids club, or at least worth humoring. Now, Fexamol announced, his voice taking on that rehearsed quality of a tour guide approaching the main attraction. We come to the crown jewel of our collection, the centerpiece of the Hall of Extinct Species. Prepare yourself, human, for you are about to witness greatness brought low. They entered a chamber that made the previous halls look like storage closets. The ceiling arched overhead in a dome of programmable matter that currently displayed a star field. Not just any star field, but a historical recreation of the galaxy, as it had appeared 15,000 years ago. Whole sections glowed with a particular golden hue, highlighting what must have been hundreds of systems. And there, in the center of the room, on a raised platform, surrounded by protective fields and dramatic lighting, sat a skull. Not just any skull, mind you. This thing was enormous, easily twice the size of a human head, covered in intricate metallic modifications that had been fused directly to the bone. Precious metals formed geometric patterns across the cranium. What looked like circuit-like engravings traced paths between augmentation points. The jaw had been replaced entirely with some kind of ceremonial piece that probably cost more than Justin's entire education. A crowd had already gathered, various species murmuring in appreciation or reverence or whatever passed for tourist awe in their respective cultures. The lighting shifted, casting dramatic shadows that made the skull look even more imposing. "Behold," Fexmol intoned, spreading 4 of his 6 arms in a gesture that probably looked impressive to someone, "the skull of Emperor Daxthun, the Immortal, supreme ruler of the Von Imperium. For 6,000 years, the Von dominated 40% of known space. Their technology was legendary, their military might unmatched. Their empire, built on the bones of lesser species who wisely chose to submit rather than resist." Justin stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Something about the proportions felt wrong, or maybe too right. He pulled out his portable scanner, a device about the size of a coffee cup that could analyze molecular structure faster than you could say invasive testing. "The Von," Fexmol continued, warming to his subject now, "were true masters of the galaxy. They understood what so many species fail to grasp, that strength is the only currency that matters among the stars. They took what they wanted, dominated whom they pleased, and built monuments that still stand on 100 worlds." He paused dramatically. "And yet, even they fell, vanished, mysteriously, leaving only ruins and relics, like this magnificent specimen." Other museum-goers pressed closer, recording devices active, soaking in the narrative of mighty beings brought to mysterious ends. A reptilian tourist asked about the Von's military tactics. An avian visitor wanted to know about their faster-than-light technology. Justin's scanner beeped softly. He frowned, adjusted the settings, ran it again. "The prevailing theory," Fexamol said, now fully in lecture mode, "is that the Von grew too powerful, too quickly. Perhaps they encountered something even they couldn't conquer. Perhaps they turned on themselves. We may never know. What we do know is that they serve as a reminder. Even the greatest empires are temporary. Even the strongest eventually. Why does it have human teeth?" The question dropped into the reverent silence like a brick through a stained glass window. Fexmol's mandibles froze mid-click. What?" Justin pointed at the skull, his scanner still humming. "The dental structure. Those are human bicuspids, human canines. The jaw hinge, the tooth count, the wear patterns. That's all human. He gestured with the scanner. See the wisdom tooth sockets? Third molars, all 4 positions. That's a distinctly human trait. Most species either have them or don't. Humans are one of the few that sometimes develop them and sometimes don't. Several tourists stopped recording and started actually looking at the skull instead of just photographing it. That's absurd, Fexmol sputtered, his antennae twitching in what might have been indignation or confusion or possibly both. This is clearly von cranial structure. The modifications alone are attached to a human skull, Justin interrupted, not rudely, but with the kind of certainty that came from spending years identifying bone fragments in dig sites. Look at the supraorbital ridge, the cranial capacity, the mastoid process. He pulled up comparative imaging on his tablet, displaying it for anyone nearby to see. That's human anatomy under all the fancy metalwork. A college scientist in the crowd, distinguished by the academic markers on her carapace, pulled out her own scanner. She ran it over the skull, her mandibles clicking in what sounded like surprise. The molecular structure. There are markers consistent with Earth-based biology. Contamination, Fexamol insisted, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Obviously, someone's equipment is poorly calibrated. This is the skull of Emperor Daxthun, verified and authenticated by the finest xenoarchaeologists in the U. When was the last time someone ran a DNA analysis? Justin asked. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Fexmol's antennae drooped slightly. The provenance is beyond question. The skull was recovered from the Imperial Palace on Von Prime itself, sealed in a ceremonial chamber, surrounded by... But when did someone last actually test it? Justin pressed. He was already pulling up the museum's public database on his tablet, scrolling through acquisition records. Says here it was added to the collection 600 years ago, authenticated by... He squinted at the text. A team of researchers who also believed that space was filled with luminiferous ether, so maybe not the most reliable. An aquatic being in a mobility suit bubbled something that the translator rendered as, "The human raises a valid point. Scientific methodology has advanced significantly in 6 centuries." More scanners came out. More readings were taken. The crowd was growing, word spreading through the museum's communication network that something interesting was happening at the Von exhibit. And by interesting, they probably meant potentially embarrassing for the museum staff. Fexmol's carapace had taken on a slightly darker shade, which Justin's cultural database suggested was the Khalid equivalent of blushing. This is highly irregular. Security should be called. You're disrupting the other guests' experiences. I'm just asking questions, Justin said mildly, though his scanner was now doing a deep structural analysis that would have made his university ethics board very nervous. Standard archaeological practice. You want to know what you're looking at? You test it, multiple times, with updated equipment. The scanner beeped again. Justin looked at the results, blinked, looked again, and felt that particular sensation that archaeologists live for, the moment when you realize everything everyone thought they knew was completely, utterly, magnificently wrong. "Huh," he said, which was possibly the most understated response in the history of galactic academia. "That's interesting." "What?" demanded Fexmol, now pressing closer, despite himself. "What? Does it say?" Justin turned the scanner display so everyone could see. The molecular breakdown glowed in cheerful colors that seemed inappropriate for what they were revealing. "That's not just human dental structure," Justin said, his voice carefully level. "That's human everything. DNA markers, bone density, cellular structure. That's a human skull under all the modifications. He paused, running the analysis again just to be sure. A very old human skull, granted. The dating suggests roughly 12 to 15,000 years, which would put it right in the... Impossible. Fexmol cut in, but his protest sounded hollow even to him. Humans are barely spacefaring. You've only just achieved primitive, faster-than-light travel. 15,000 years ago, you were still hitting each other with rocks. Were we, though? Justin mused, mostly to himself, but several translator devices picked it up anyway. A massive figure pushed through the growing crowd. Kulbix, the museum's director, his reptilian bulk making tourists scatter like startled fish. His scales gleamed dark green under the museum lighting, and his vertical pupils fixed on Justin with the kind of focus usually reserved for prey animals. "What?" Kulibix rumbled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Is the meaning of this disruption?" Fexmol immediately launched into an explanation that involved a lot of gesturing and several references to unauthorized testing and defiling sacred exhibits. Justin waited patiently until the curator ran out of steam, then held up his scanner. "Director Kulbix, I presume? I was just conducting some routine analysis of your Von collection. Standard archaeological practice when encountering unfamiliar specimens." "The Von are not unfamiliar," Kulbix growled. "They are one of the most studied extinct civilizations in galactic history." "Right. But here's the thing," Justin said, pulling up his data again. "This isn't a Von skull. It's human. Would you like to see the DNA breakdown? Because I've got molecular markers that match Earth-based biology, genetic drift analysis that suggests a population separated from the main human gene pool roughly 12 to 15,000 years ago, and dental records that would make any human orthodontist very happy." The crowd had grown considerably. News feeds were definitely recording this now. Justin could see at least 3 different species with what were obviously professional broadcasting equipment. Kulbix stared at the scanner display for a long moment. His tail, thick as a tree trunk, swished in what might have been agitation. "You're suggesting that the Von Imperium, one of the greatest civilizations in galactic history, was human?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Justin replied. "I'm just reading what the tests say. But, if you'd like to be sure, I'd recommend running a full analysis on your entire Von collection. You have, what, couple hundred specimens across the museum?" 238, Fexmol supplied automatically, then looked like he wished he hadn't. "Perfect sample size," Justin said cheerfully. "Run DNA analysis on, say, 20 random specimens. Should give us a pretty clear picture of whether this is an isolated case or a pattern." Kulbix's eyes narrowed to slits. For a moment, Justin wondered if he'd pushed too far, if he was about to be escorted off the station by security, with a polite but firm suggestion never to return. Then the director's tail stopped swishing. "Do it," Kulbix ordered. "Pull 20 specimens at random from storage. Run full molecular analysis. I want results within the hour." Fexmol made a sound like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. "Director, surely this is unnecessary. The human's equipment is clearly malfunctioning." "Then the tests will prove him wrong," Kulibix interrupted. "And we can all have a good laugh at the primitive human and his faulty scanner. But if there's even a possibility that our flagship collection has been misidentified for 600 years, I want to know about it before the Galactic Historical Society does." The next hour passed in a blur of activity that would have been comical if it hadn't been so tense. Museum staff scurried about pulling samples from climate-controlled storage. Scientists from various species, many of whom had been visiting tourists moments before, volunteered their equipment and expertise. The Hall of Extinct Species became an impromptu laboratory, with portable testing stations set up on every available surface. Justin found himself working alongside a Khalid xenobiologist named Lixfen, who had initially been skeptical but was now muttering calculations under her breath as each new test came back. An aquatic scholar in a mobility suit double-checked the genetic drift analysis. A crystalline being, whose name Justin couldn't pronounce, contributed a molecular scanner that made his equipment look like a child's toy. Fexamol hovered nearby, growing increasingly agitated as each new result appeared. Sample 1, human. Sample 2, human. Sample 3, human. By sample 8, tourists had stopped taking photos of the exhibits and started recording the scientists instead. This was apparently better entertainment than extinct species. Watching the experts realize they'd been wrong for centuries. Sample 15, human. Sample 20, definitely, unquestionably, no room for doubt, human. Fexamol sat down heavily on a bench designed for beings with different anatomy, looking like his entire worldview had just filed for divorce. 20 for 20, Lixfen announced, her voice carrying across the now silent hall. All specimens showed DNA markers consistent with Earth-based human biology. Genetic drift analysis confirms temporal separation from main human population between 12 and 15,000 years ago. Margin of error less than 3%. The silence stretched like taffy. Then someone's translator device hiccuped, producing a sound uncomfortably close to a laugh. And Justin, standing in the middle of a galactic museum surrounded by the bones of an empire no one had realized was human, thought about the implications and felt something between awe and the kind of hilarity that comes from profound absurdity. "So," he said into the quiet, "anyone want to check the architectural records? Because I'm suddenly very curious about those Von monuments on other worlds." Kulbix made a sound like a volcano clearing its throat. This was going to be a very long day. Kulbix didn't just pull architectural records. He dumped the entire Von database onto the main display screens, which now covered half the hall's dome ceiling. Images cascaded across the curved surface. Temples, monuments, city layouts, astronomical observatories, all built by the supposedly glorious and definitely extinct Von Imperium. Justin stood in the center of the hall, neck craned back, tablet in hand, scrolling through Earth's archaeological database with the kind of focus that made everything else fade to background noise. "That one," he said, pointing at a massive stone structure on a world designated Kex 2. "Zoom in on the astronomical alignments." The image expanded. The structure showed a circular arrangement of massive stones, each positioned to mark specific celestial events: solstices, equinoxes, planetary conjunctions. Justin pulled up a comparison image from his tablet, projected it onto a secondary screen. "That's from a site in what we call Britain, built roughly 4,000 years ago according to our records, but the engineering suggests older techniques." He rotated both images. Same astronomical alignments, same engineering solutions for moving stones that weigh several tons, same architectural language. "Coincidence," Fexamol muttered, but his antennae were drooping so far they nearly touched the floor. "Sure," Justin agreed. "Let's check another one." A temple complex on Von Prime itself, the supposed heart of the ancient empire. Massive stepped pyramids arranged in precise geometric patterns, aligned to cardinal directions with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible without advanced surveying equipment. Justin's tablet displayed a site from Central America. The layout matched so perfectly it looked like someone had used a copy machine across 15,000 years and several hundred light-years of space. Lixofen was running her own comparisons now, her mandibles clicking in rapid calculation. The mathematical ratios are identical, the golden mean, incorporated into the architectural proportions, the astronomical knowledge required to achieve these alignments. Was available to ancient humans, Justin finished. Or at least, to some ancient humans. The ones who apparently left Earth, conquered half the galaxy, and then... He paused, frowning at the timeline data. Then just vanished. The word vanished echoed through the hall with uncomfortable weight. More images appeared on the screens. A Von outpost on the edge of their former territory showed megalithic construction techniques identical to sites in Bolivia. A ceremonial center on a moon in the Khalid sector displayed the same artistic motifs found in ancient Egyptian architecture. A fortress world had stoneworks that could have been twins to structures in Peru. Tourists weren't even pretending to look at the other exhibits anymore. This was better than any planned presentation. This was history rewriting itself in real time, and everyone wanted footage. The dating is consistent, announced the crystalline scientist, whose scanner was apparently capable of temporal analysis that made Justin's equipment look like counting on fingers. All Von structures fall within a 6,000-year period, beginning approximately 15,000 years ago and ending roughly 9,000 years ago. And then nothing, Justin said quietly. They just stopped building, stopped expanding. The empire collapsed completely, within what looks like a single generation. Kolobix had been silent for the past 20 minutes, his massive form perfectly still as he processed the implications. Now he turned to Justin, his vertical pupils focusing with uncomfortable intensity. Human. This suggests your species once controlled hundreds of star systems, had faster-than-light technology thousands of years before your current civilization, built an empire that rivaled anything in modern galactic space. His tail swished once, sharply. And you expect us to believe you didn't know? The question carried weight beyond mere curiosity. Political weight. The kind that started diplomatic incidents. Justin met his gaze steadily. Director, 3 months ago I had to explain to my department head why I needed funding to study pottery fragments from ancient Mesopotamia. My government barely approved the budget for the spacecraft that got me here. We've been in space, meaningfully, for less than 2 centuries with primitive faster-than-light drives we barely understand. He gestured at the screens full of impossible architecture. If we'd known about any of this, do you really think we'd be flying around in ships that still use combustion toilets? That got a laugh from several species in the crowd who'd apparently experienced human spacecraft accommodations. But this raises the essential question, Lixfen interjected, her tone shifting from scientific curiosity to something more concerned. If humans built the Von Imperium, if they had this level of technology and power, what happened? Where did they go? They went home, Justin said, still staring at the architectural comparisons. Back to Earth. The question is why? Fexmol finally stood up from his bench, his carapace having gone through several color changes in the past hour. There must be records. The Von kept extensive documentation, libraries, data archives, something that explains. Actually, Kolbix interrupted, pulling up a new display. There might be. We've had sealed Von data cores in deep storage for decades. Never could crack the encryption. Always assumed we'd eventually develop the technology to access them. He paused. We thought they were written in an extinct alien language. But they're not, Justin said, understanding dawning. They're in an extinct human language. Can you read it? Kolbix demanded. Justin laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Director, I can barely read modern French, and that's still being spoken. But Earth has linguists who specialize in dead languages. Proto-Indo-European, Ancient Sumerian, lost dialects. He stopped, thinking. Actually, send me samples of the Von written language. Let's see what we're working with. Files transferred to his tablet. Ancient text appeared, symbols and characters that had stumped galactic scholars for centuries. Justin stared at them for a long moment, pulled up comparative databases from Earth's linguistic archives, ran pattern recognition software that looked for structural similarities. His tablet beeped. "Oh," he said softly. "Oh, that's fascinating." "What?" demanded 3 different voices simultaneously. "It's not one language," Justin explained, excitement creeping into his tone despite the circumstances. "It's a hybrid. Elements of Proto-Indo-European, Ancient Sumerian cuneiform, what looks like early Sanskrit, and something else I don't recognize but might be a precursor to ancient Chinese characters." He looked up at Kolbix. "This is a constructed language. Something deliberately created by combining elements from multiple Earth-based linguistic families." "Why would they do that?" Fexmol asked. Justin thought about the question, about the implications, about an empire that spanned hundreds of worlds, and then chose to disappear. "Maybe," he said slowly, "because they wanted to make sure that if anyone from Earth ever found these records, they'd need to work together to translate them. Multiple language families means multiple cultural perspectives required to decode the message." He pulled up the files on the sealed data cores, location information, access protocols. "Director," Justin said, "I need to make a call to Earth, and you're going to want to convene the Galactic Council." "Why?" Kolbix asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be comforting. "Because," Justin replied, gesturing at the screens full of human architecture scattered across 100 alien worlds, "we're about to find out why an empire that conquered half the galaxy decided to go home and forget they'd ever left. And something tells me the answer is going to change everything." News traveled fast in a galaxy connected by faster-than-light communication networks. News about humans possibly being the legendary Von Imperium traveled at speeds that probably violated several physics laws out of pure scandal velocity. Within 3 hours, Heritage Prime's communication systems were so overloaded that the station's AI started prioritizing traffic by how much shouting was involved. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Earth's diplomatic corps had what Justin's tablet delicately described as a collective nervous breakdown, and approximately 24 other museums across known space started frantically DNA testing their own Von collections. The results came back with depressing consistency. Human, human, human. Definitely human. So human, it hurts. Justin sat in a converted conference room that had been hastily cleared of tourists and their various bodily needs, some species requiring very specific atmospheric conditions, watching the chaos unfold on multiple screens. Beside him, Tony had arrived from Earth's embassy station looking like she'd been woken up, told the universe was ending, handed terrible coffee, and expected to fix everything before lunch. "So," Tony said, her voice carrying that particular tone of diplomatic exhaustion, "let me make sure I understand this correctly. We accidentally discovered that ancient humans built a massive galactic empire, then deliberately erased all memory of it and went back to hitting things with rocks." "That's the working theory," Justin confirmed. "And now, every species in the galaxy thinks either we've been playing the longest con in history or we're about to reclaim our former territory and start the sequel nobody asked for. Also accurate. Tony rubbed her temples. I miss last week when our biggest diplomatic crisis was explaining why humans find pineapple on pizza controversial. On the screens, talking heads from a dozen different species debated the implications. A Khalid political analyst insisted this proved humans were naturally duplicitous. An aquatic philosopher suggested humans were engaged in a multi-generational strategy of strategic weakness. A crystalline historian proposed that perhaps humans were simply incredibly bad at record-keeping, which, given Earth's track record of losing entire civilizations in filing errors, wasn't entirely unfair. The Galactic Council chamber appeared on the primary screen, representatives from 30 species arranged in their designated seating pods. The Council Prime, a being whose species name translated roughly as the ones who talk too much at parties, called the session to order with considerably less ceremony than usual. We are here, they announced, to address the revelation that humanity may have previously achieved galactic dominance under the designation Von Imperium. Earth's representatives will explain. Tony stood, smoothed her jacket in a gesture Justin recognized as her preparing to lie through her teeth if necessary, then apparently decided honesty was the better option. We didn't know, she said flatly. Earth's historical records go back maybe 6,000 years with any reliability. Everything before that is archaeological guesswork, mythology, and arguments between academics who communicate primarily through passive-aggressive footnotes. If our ancestors built a star empire, they did a phenomenal job of hiding it from us. Convenient, muttered a Khalid representative. Is it? Tony shot back. Because, from where I'm standing, finding out your species used to rule half the galaxy and then voluntarily gave it up is the kind of revelation that makes you question everything. It's not convenient. It's terrifying. That landed differently than expected. Several representatives shifted in their pods. A reptilian counselor spoke up. Ambassador, the concern is not what your ancestors did. The concern is what modern humans might do with this knowledge. Will you attempt to reclaim former territories? With what? Tony asked, genuine exasperation bleeding through diplomatic training. We have maybe 300 spacecraft capable of long-range travel, half of which are held together with optimism and recycled parts. Our most advanced weapons are cute by galactic standards. We're barely maintaining colonies on our own moons. She paused. Do you really think we're going to reconquer an empire our ancestors deliberately abandoned? Justin pulled up a holographic display showing Earth's current military and technological capabilities compared to the estimated strength of the ancient Von Imperium at its height. The difference was so vast, it became comical. The Von, he said, standing to join Tony, had faster-than-light technology that makes our current drives look like steam engines. They built structures we still can't replicate with modern construction equipment. They controlled hundreds of systems simultaneously. We can barely agree on international time zone standards. A few representatives made sounds that translators interpreted as laughter. But here's what really matters, Justin continued, pulling up the data core location files. We found sealed archives on 3 different Von worlds, encrypted data that your best cryptographers couldn't crack for centuries. We think they're written in a constructed human language, deliberately designed to require multiple cultural perspectives to decode. He displayed samples of the writing. Linguists in the council chamber leaned forward, their various sensory organs focusing on the text. These aren't random records, Justin explained. The locations were too deliberate. Imperial Palace on Von Prime, the Central Library on their university world, a sealed chamber on what appears to have been their capital military installation. Someone wanted these specific records preserved and protected. Protected from what? Asked an avian representative. Maybe from being destroyed when they collapsed their own empire, Justin suggested. Or maybe from being found too easily. These cores are time capsules, but with locks that require the right cultural keys to open. Kulabix's image appeared on a secondary screen from the museum. We've been analyzing the physical construction of the cores. They're designed to survive planetary catastrophes, stellar radiation, even the heat death of the local star system. Someone went to enormous effort to ensure these records would last. And now you want to open them, the Council Prime stated. We need to, Tony said, because every species in this chamber is asking the same question. Why did the Vaughn disappear? If they were human, why did humans give up an empire? What scared them badly enough, or inspired them deeply enough, to deliberately regress to a pre-technological state? She let that sink in. The answer to that question, Tony continued, matters to everyone. Because if something made the most powerful empire in galactic history choose extinction over continuation, maybe we should know what it was. The chamber fell silent. Unless, Justin added quietly, you'd prefer to keep wondering, keep assuming humans are either master manipulators or potential conquerors. Keep treating ancient history as entertainment instead of warning. He gestured at the sealed data cores on the display. Or we could actually learn from the past before we repeat it. The Council Prime's translucent body rippled, their species equivalent of deep thought. Earth's linguists can decode this writing? They asked. We think so, Justin replied, given time and cooperation. The language is human-derived, but it's complex. We'll need specialists in multiple ancient Earth languages working together. How long? Justin glanced at Tony, who shrugged in a way that said, your guess is as good as mine. Best case? 2 weeks to establish basic translation protocols. Full decoding could take months. You have 1 week, the Council Prime declared, at which point you will present preliminary findings to this council. We need to know what the Vaughn discovered that made them choose to forget themselves. The session ended. Screens went dark. Tony looked at Justin. 1 week to decode a language that's been dead for 12,000 years. Encrypted in data cores our ancestors specifically designed to be difficult to access, containing information that might explain why they abandoned the most powerful empire in galactic history. No pressure, Justin agreed. His tablet chimed. Messages from Earth, every linguistic specialist, archaeological institution, and historical society on the planet apparently wanted in on this project. Also, several messages from his mother asking if he was eating properly, and whether he'd met any nice alien girls at the museum. Some things, at least, never changed. 6 days, 14 hours, and roughly 800 cups of coffee, or various alien equivalents that ranged from mildly stimulating to possibly radioactive. Later, Justin sat in a laboratory that had been assembled with the kind of speed that suggested several building codes had been enthusiastically ignored. Screens covered every wall. Linguists from Earth appeared on video feeds, arguing in 5 different languages about grammatical structures that had been dead longer than most civilizations had been alive. The sealed data cores sat in the center of the room, connected to decryption equipment that looked like it had been designed by 3 different species who'd never actually spoken to each other. Tony paced behind him, subsisting entirely on what she called diplomatic spite, and what Justin suspected was actually just anxiety given physical form. "Tell me we have something," she said for the 40th time that hour. "We have something," Justin replied, not looking up from his screen. "I'm just not sure what it is yet." The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source, a linguistic specialist in India who'd noticed that parts of the Van script matched patterns found in ancient Harappan texts, combined with a researcher in Peru who recognized structural elements from pre-Incan languages, working with a team in Egypt who'd spent decades studying hieroglyphic grammar. Individually, none of them could crack it. Together, they'd managed to decode roughly 60% of the core's contents. 60% was enough. "Got it," Justin said suddenly, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of equipment and multilingual arguing. "Primary core is unlocked. Beginning data extraction." The screens filled with text, flowing in columns that reorganized themselves as the translation algorithms worked. Images appeared, three-dimensional recordings of people who'd been dust for 12,000 years, speaking in voices that crackled with age but carried unmistakable human cadence. A face resolved on the central screen. Male, appearing to be in his 60s by modern standards, with modifications similar to those on the skull in the museum. But the eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with carrying impossible weight. "Emperor Dax Thun," Justin breathed. The recording began speaking. The translation algorithms stuttered, then found their rhythm, producing subtitles that scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "If you are watching this," the Emperor said, "then enough time has passed. Enough cycles. Enough forgetting." He paused, and something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "Or perhaps not enough. And we are about to repeat our mistakes. Either way, you deserve to know what we discovered. What we chose." Tony stopped pacing. The Emperor's image shifted, replaced by star charts showing the Von Imperium at its height. Hundreds of systems glowing in golden light. Trade routes like veins connecting worlds. A civilization that had mastered space in ways modern galactic society still envied. "We were magnificent," Dax Thun's voice continued over the images. 6,000 years of expansion. We met other species. Some we traded with, some we conquered, some we simply absorbed into our empire. We thought ourselves enlightened, progressive. We gave the species we dominated access to our technology, our knowledge, our culture. A pause. We never asked if they wanted it. The star chart changed, showing different civilizations across galactic history. Species that rose, expanded, conquered, and then stagnated into irrelevance or extinction. "We sent researchers to study ancient empires," the Emperor said. "Not just those we'd encountered, but those that had fallen millennia before we achieved space travel. And we found a pattern. Every species that achieved dominance followed the same path. Expand, conquer, grow comfortable, stop innovating, slowly fade until something younger and hungrier replaced them." Images of dead civilizations filled the screens, ruins on a dozen worlds, monuments to glory that became monuments to hubris. "We realized we were already on that path," Dax Thun continued. "Our greatest minds no longer created. They managed. Our bravest souls no longer explored. They administered. Our culture celebrated what we had been, not what we could become. We were building a museum to our own magnificence while the universe moved on without us." The Emperor's face returned to the screen, and now the exhaustion in his eyes made terrible sense. "So we held a council. 500 of our wisest thinkers, from every discipline, every world, every culture we'd absorbed. We asked one question: what comes after empire?" Silence filled the laboratory. The answer, Dax Thun said, was both simple and terrifying. Nothing comes after empire while the empire still exists. The very existence of a dominant power prevents other species from rising, from innovating, from making the mistakes that lead to breakthroughs. We weren't just stagnating ourselves, we were creating a galaxy of stagnation. Images showed Von worlds where subject species lived in comfort, but never developed their own technologies, their own solutions, their own paths forward. We had become the ceiling, the Emperor said, the limit on what was possible, because why would anyone else reach for the stars when we'd already claimed them? Why innovate when you could simply request Von technology? Why struggle when you could submit? Tony was gripping the back of Justin's chair hard enough that the metal creaked. We made a choice, Dax Thune continued. Not an easy one. Not one without opposition. But we decided that the galaxy needed us gone more than it needed us present. So we would collapse our own empire, destroy our advanced technologies, return to our homeworld, start again from the beginning. The screens showed preparations, massive ships being decommissioned, technology archives being systematically erased, colonies being evacuated back to Earth. But we didn't want to just disappear, the Emperor said. We wanted to leave something behind. A warning, a reminder, a test. He smiled, and this time it was genuine. We modified ourselves genetically, subtle changes that would make our descendants think differently about power, question conquest, value cooperation over domination. It wouldn't make them perfect. Nothing could do that. But it might make them hesitant to repeat our mistakes. Justin's hands were shaking as he took notes. We built the megaliths, Dax Thune explained, not as monuments to our glory, but as breadcrumbs, as puzzles, so that when our descendants eventually returned to space, and we believed they would, they might find evidence of what came before. They might ask questions. They might wonder. The Emperor leaned forward, looking directly at whatever recording device had captured this message 12,000 years ago. If you're watching this, you've already started asking those questions. Good. Keep asking. We've left more records scattered across our former territory. Each one contains different pieces of what we learned, what we discovered, what we chose to forget. Find them. Study them. Learn from our failures. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that transcended translation. We gave you the stars once by conquering them. Now we're giving them to you again by leaving them empty. What you do with that gift is your choice. Build empire. Build cooperation. Build something we never imagined. Just build it, knowing what empire costs. The recording showed the Emperor standing, his ceremonial robes catching light from a setting sun on what must have been Von Prime. Let our children forget us, Dax Thune said, so they may remember themselves. The screen went dark. For a long moment, nobody in the laboratory moved. Then Tony laughed, a sound somewhere between hysteria and relief. They engineered their own apocalypse because they realized empire made them boring. Not boring, Justin corrected quietly. Stagnant. There's a difference. He pulled up the genetic modification data that had been included in the core. They literally rewrote human psychology to make us more questioning, more resistant to authoritarian structures, more likely to value individual innovation over collective conformity. Did it work? Tony asked. Justin thought about human history, the endless cycles of empire and rebellion, the way no human civilization had ever managed to maintain permanent dominance. The constant questioning, the perpetual dissatisfaction with status quo, the inability to accept this is how things are as a final answer. Yeah, he said. I think it did. We're genetically programmed to be difficult. His tablet chimed. The Galactic Council was convening for his report. Time to tell the galaxy that humanity's greatest ancestors had looked at ultimate power and decided their children deserved something better. This was going to be interesting.